Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Mackey. I'm with the Alliance for Safety and Justice. I want to thank you and welcome you to this town hall. We have a tremendous number of people who registered, more than 200 people. So really excited to get going here. Before we do, though, I'd like to start off with a video my good friend Bertha Purnell recorded for us.
Hi, my name is Bertha Purnell, and I'm a member of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, a national organization of more than 40,000 people who are dedicated to turning their personal experience with victimization and trauma into purpose. I want to welcome you all to the town hall sponsored by the Illinois Coalition for Shared Safety. We are a new alliance of organization and community members dedicated to helping Illinois move forward from systems that prioritize the security of some to the systems that promote shared safety for all. Today, we can hear from national experts, a panel of people who work across Illinois on victim service, violence prevention, and reentry. We will conclude with our Attorney General, Kwame Raoul, who will provide us with his perspective on our work. Before we begin, I would like to talk to you all for a few minutes about what it means to be a survivor. June 24, 2017, my youngest son, Maurice Purnell, was shot and killed here on the streets of Chicago. I no longer only speak for myself. I speak for Maurice. I speak for his children. I speak for my family in a way that his voice should have been inserted, and now he's not here to do that. I speak for survivors who allow me to speak for them until they can speak for themselves. Before we move to the next section, I would like to ask for a moment of silence.
All right, thank you so much to Bertha and her words. All right, so let's begin here. As I said, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Mackey, and I'm the Director of State and Local Government Best Practices at the Alliance for Safety and Justice. Before we move into the heart of our town hall, a panel discussion between Illinois safety experts, my colleague and I, Marissa Rona, would like to spend some time orienting today's conversation. First, I want to provide a brief overview of the Illinois Coalition for Shared Safety and use this as an opportunity to invite you to join this work. While my current role at the Alliance for Safety and Justice is national in scope, I've worked in Illinois criminal justice reform and policy for more than 10 years. In my experience, I don't think I've ever seen such a diverse alliance of organizations come together in quite the way that this coalition has. As a body of more than 20 organizations, our collective work spans Illinois' entire non-governmental safety system, from violence prevention to victim services to reentry. And while our organizations work in the same kind of space, many of us have never worked together before. And there have been times, I'm sure, where we've been on opposite sides of the same issue. At a fundamental level, what brought us together for this work is a change that I think we're all probably feeling right now, a potential paradigm shift that is going on in our state and across our country. I think it's common, when this kind of social change happens, it can brew and simmer for a very long time, but it often needs something external to activate it, to turn it on. In our case, the external event was the pandemic. In late March, as the pandemic began to alter our lives and shut down our state and local economies, it was quickly clear to everyone who works in safety that COVID was going to have a profound impact on the people we love and serve. It is a sad and tragic truth that people who live with concentrated disadvantage, victimization, poverty, racial isolation tend to experience crises earlier, at higher levels, and for longer periods of time. This case is proving to be no different. Even in the early days of the pandemic, COVID began to hit Illinois communities disproportionately, focusing harm on people who were already the most harmed, but least helped. Based on our experiences, our members knew that the already scarce and insufficient resources our state provides these populations was going to become scarcer. And that's why in early April, we first came together. We saw the need to help policymakers and elected officials understand how the pandemic was impacting crime survivors, justice-involved people, and where they live. We also began to advocate for essential resources. So through our efforts and champions like leader Jahan Gordon Booth and Attorney General Raoul, who will join us at the end of our town hall, we fought to keep funding flat for services in our state budget. And we also worked with the Pritzker administration to focus about $20 million of funding from the Department of Justice to help people to help people who are hardest hit by COVID. The more we engaged in this kind of advocacy and education, I think also the more we understood that the dominant framework of doing this kind of work wasn't going to help us. Now, by dominant framework, what I mean is the core set of assumptions and beliefs that guide our work and how we think about it. And for a very long time, I want to suggest that this framework has been primarily grounded in a concept of security. That is an understanding or assumption that our work is fundamentally about protecting people and the threat of violence. Protecting people from the threat of violence. Now, let me be clear. If you are being threatened, security is really important. It's absolutely vital. No one can live a full and free life under the threat of violence. However, the threat that security is predicated upon also points to the problem of using it as a comprehensive framework to guide policy, practices, and also funding. Security assumes, it has to assume the presence of a threat. To be more precise, for security to work, for you to feel its appeal, you have to believe there is another person or a group of people who will hurt you if they can. This security framework makes it not only easy, but necessary to prejudge, to pathologize, to dehumanize other people. A security framework then turns this threat of violence it is predicated upon against the people it deems threatening. As a framework for policy and thinking about violence reduction and reentry victim services, security will always focus on protecting some at the expense of others. I think the security framework has guided policy in much of our culture for at least the last 40 years. It's part of the reason why our country over-relies on criminal justice systems. I think it explains why we have spent billions of dollars building up literally the largest prison system in the history of the world. And it stands behind the militarization of police and the idea that the best way to deal with crime is to wage a war against people. This idea of security has also been infused into many of our frameworks of services. So this is problematic on many levels, but one of the essential problems with our security framework is that we have persistently confused it for safety. So let me try this. Like here's the problem in a nutshell. On the one hand, I can be secure if I intimidate you, if I coerce you, if I incarcerate you, but I can never be safe, just like you will never be safe in this kind of relationship. Security relies on the lack of safety, and it relies on inequality. But on the other hand, my safety depends on your safety, just as your safety depends on mine. At its core, safety has to be shared because it relies on trust and equality. We can only be safe together. So it is in this sense that shared safety provides us with, I think, a powerful alternative to the framework we've used. And whereas our security framework has led us to over-rely and over-invest in prisons and law enforcement, a framework for shared safety can help us focus our investments, our policy work on the programs we know make us safe. So I think this work is about vision. You know, we should not aspire to live in a secure world where we have to be afraid of each other. We should aspire instead to build a safe world where we all can flourish. I think as we think about this, I think it's also really crucial to realize that these are policy frameworks. And what I mean by that is, you know, these ideas that guide policy are often, they're really powerful, but they're not laws of nature. You know, they're not like gravity, which we have no choice but to live with. A security framework is deep within us and our society, but ultimately it was made by and perpetuated through people's choices and actions. And as this kind of framework was made, we can also unmake it. Now, I don't want to suggest this will be easy at all. Developing and implementing a shared safety framework will require a tremendous amount of work. And most fundamentally, it will require a reckoning with the generations of harm that have been inflicted upon people in the name of security. But this work is already beginning to take shape in Illinois and across the country. But for this truly to take hold, for this to happen, we need a community of shared safety. So after the town hall we're doing today, we're going to send the more than 200 people who've registered a survey. In this survey, we're going to invite you to join this work, to be a part of it, to help shape it. I'd like now to turn things over to my colleague, Marissa, who will talk about her work standing up shared safety all across the country. Marissa?
Thank you so much for that beautiful opening, John, and Miss Bertha too. Appreciate y'all so much. My name is Marissa Rona. I'm the Local Safety Solutions Project Director, Shared Safety Project Director with the Alliance for Safety and Justice. And some keywords that came up in John Mackey's beautiful opening are words we don't often hear in at the decision-making table. Hope, safety for all, drivers of well-being, thriving communities, not just surviving communities. And as John mentioned, we've started this work. It's been 4 or 5 years now across the country. We've done a ton of visioning safety focus groups in Illinois, across Illinois. And one of the most important things to remember about shared safety is that it is a framework. It's not a new program. It's not a new initiative. It's not a pilot that anyone's going to, ask for funding. It is a framework that can be overlaid in any community within the unique circumstances of any community to connect all of the amazing work that's already happening on the ground in government, within service providers across that community, but that maybe people don't know about. It's unseen. So it's a framework that connects all of the great work that's already going on and then can help a community define safety for themselves collectively and start seeing where there are gaps or where impacts can begin to get leveraged. And ultimately, it's a framework that can help community use that collective definition of safety to get to budget priorities at the government level, local, state, federal, that really reflect those collective definitions of safety. And what we've learned in leading visioning safety focus groups across the country, all over Illinois, there are a few really important lessons learned that we've gotten from centering survivors at a discussion around safety, and then having these discussions that start first with peer groups. So we've done visioning safety, what we call visioning safety focus groups with law enforcement, survivors, with individuals in jail, sheriffs who have allowed us to go inside a jail, with probation populations. And we've learned these important things. One, they're called visioning safety focus groups. And John mentioned this in his opening remarks. This work is really about visioning safety and identifying the good things that are already happening in every community, and then finding ways to drive up drivers of well-being and really looking at protective factors, good things, community-led, community-based interventions, really looking at them as the drivers of safety, in addition to looking at what are the drivers of crime. Another important thing we've learned from speaking with survivors is the conversation has to look different. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit later today, and it should feel different. Survivors have let us know that the traditional way of governments or service providers or funders even asking them for their needs is to say, tell us all the ways our systems have failed you, and then let us know how we should fix them. And survivors have really said, we are re-traumatized, we are re-triggered, we are harmed again when the discussion happens in the way that it has always happened. If we want a new framework, we have to have a new way of having this discussion. And important and central and critical to that discussion is this reckoning with race, equity, with social justice issues, with gender equity, and really this acknowledgement that systems as they were created were really, have always been ill-equipped, under-resourced, poorly designed to really address the needs of survivors. It's not like decades ago, survivors got together and said, this is what we need when we experience trauma, or marginalized communities got together and said, this is what we need, right? Someone else designed those systems. And as John also mentioned, that's helpful because we can find blame and fault in systems. We can find gaps in systems, but we can hold ourselves and people accountable for transformations of those systems. So there's no blame to be spread around among the individuals who are working so hard to change and transform these systems, really led by survivors like Ms. Bertha, and then circling back with elected officials like the Attorney General, who we are going to hear from. And so that's hopefully an explanation of the principles that are on the screen here. Shared safety is a framework that centers a survivor's voice. And when you do that, you have a different kind of conversation. You use a public health frame. And when you do that, you define safety differently. You define it as well-being. And when you do that, you really start breaking the cycle of harm, the cycle of intergenerational harm, and you really help start making the system work. And that's exactly what the panel is going to help us discuss next. If I can kick it off to, if this slide works here, to our wonderful moderator, Catherine Bocanegra.
Thank you, Marissa. I'm Dr. Catherine Bocanegra. I'm an assistant professor at University of Illinois Chicago's Jane Addams School of Social Work, and I'm honored today, first and foremost, to support the work of the Alliance for Shared Safety. I come from 15 years of work in community violence prevention. And when I ran programs to prevent violence or attend to its aftermath, I was often frustrated in the way in which violence is categorized and siloed. In other words, you can come to my program if you've been affected by street violence. However, if you're a survivor of domestic violence, I'm going to refer you elsewhere. And the members of this coalition break down these false barriers through their collaborative approach and by representing a wide spectrum of survivor supports. I'm also honored to stand virtually alongside people like Dr. Blair Lewis, Chris Patterson, Vicki Smith, and Orlando Mayorga, our esteemed panel members today. If the aim of this town hall is to move from security for a few to safety for all, then we need solutions that are survivor-centered, safety-driven, and racially equitable. And this is what you're going to hear from our panelists today. So with that, I'm first going to introduce Orlando Mayorga and ask him the first panel question. So Orlando Mayorga is the Director of Reentry, a mentor, and a community anti-violence educator facilitator at Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, a community-based organization in Chicago's Back of the Yards neighborhood. Orlando, last year you were part of a coalition of organizations that studied and made recommendations to improve the Illinois crime victim compensation system. This report then was handed over and reviewed by different stakeholders throughout the state, and it helped and inform and support changes in the Attorney General's office that they are taking into consideration to broaden services for all survivors. Can you talk about what your experience was like being a part of this coalition and what it was like advocating for changes in policy?
Good afternoon, everybody. Personally, it was a very fulfilling, purpose-filled opportunity. And I say that because oftentimes people like myself, who has been system impacted, our voices, and my voice specifically, are not often validated or supported in that way. So being able to be part of that process, to provide input, to provide my perspective on what it is to have survived systems of oppression, again, did something very positive for my inner well-being. But again, it's not often the case. Though I have a unique perspective, I am not the only person that has experienced these things. And yet our voices are not always either welcomed or validated in spaces like the ones I was privileged enough to be part of. When it comes to identifying gaps, when it comes to recognizing people who are living on the margins, I believe that directly impacted people have answers and solutions that others do not have, because we have the personal experience to be able to identify those gaps. It's extremely important to understand that from a personal and a professional opinion, I believe that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And again, it is because we've lived through various traumas and have come out at the other end having found some healing. Healing that doesn't occur as an individual process, I believe, but happens in the collective. So when there was comments made about finding healing in collaboration, in peer-led spaces, I was privileged again to be part of those spaces and being able to find healing with other people similar in sharing my experiences that helped me to find and value my voice and understand that my voice has value in the spaces where decisions are being made about how policies and legislation are going to be impacting our communities. So to be part of that process with yourself, with John, and the many others who contributed to the crime victim compensation redraft and languaging in a way that values all survivors was very fulfilling, and I'm thankful for having been part of that process. I can only hope that those opportunities are made available going forward in all of these spaces where policy and legislation are being decided for, and having our voices included.
Thank you so much, Orlando. So to follow up on your comments, I now want to introduce Vicki Smith. Vicki Smith is the Executive Director of the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And Vicki, I would like to ask you, how does Orlando's experience with policy advocacy and his process from skepticism to engagement, how does that resonate with the domestic violence movement?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the Alliance for Safety and Justice for giving us this opportunity here in Illinois to really explore all of these questions. Victim services, domestic violence victim services in particular, was built from the ground up. It was built by survivors, and it was built based upon the experiences that they had, those that were able to come to the table, able to think about what they had been through and what they wanted to have happen. And that's how original services were designed. Over time, those services have been adapted somewhat, sometimes because we are listening to survivors, sometimes because the money comes and says, this is the way we're going to do it, which is not often built based upon response from survivors. But I think listening to Orlando and listening to what he's been through, one of the most important things for survivors to experience is some kind of success. When I say to you what has happened to me, and you A, believe me, and then you B, work with me to figure out a good response, and then listen to other survivors about what their experiences have been and build upon those initial successes and those initial responses, then we begin to develop a system of safety for all. A lot in my own personal experience, I hear from survivors all the time. They call us because they want to talk about policy change based on something that happened to them that didn't go the way they thought it should go. And a lot of what we have to talk to them about is it's already law. It's not being applied the way it was meant to be applied when it was designed. And so going back to this idea that survivors have to be at the center, if we're not listening to a broad range of survivors and putting all those experiences together and then letting those individuals see and feel the experience of this made me, this helped me, then we're not designing anything to help anybody.
Thank you so much, Vicki, for your response. To follow up, I would like to introduce Dr. Blair Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the manager of the Advocate Trauma Recovery Center. The Trauma Recovery Center is dedicated to meeting the needs of crime survivors that struggle to access services. So Dr. Lewis, from your work, what are some of the barriers your clients have experienced? What needs do they have? And how can our systems do a better job of meeting them?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Catherine. And I'd first like to start talking about the impact of trauma. Before we can even talk about what is accessible to our patients or clients, we also have to talk about and lead into talking about what is actually accessed. So looking at accessibility and things that people are engaging in, let's first talk about the impact of trauma. Trauma can have a variation of responses. And it is not necessarily guaranteed that you will experience some of what we call trauma or stress symptoms after experiencing a stressful traumatic event. However, it oftentimes may have an impact on emotional expression, on behavior, on social interactions, as well as your ability to function on a day-to-day like you did prior to the event. And so when patients come to the Trauma Recovery Center, some of the things that we are looking at is how exactly can we reach this population? And when you have experienced a crime, there's a different ring, or there's a certain level of safety concerns that comes along with experiencing that type of trauma, especially if it was violent. You're talking about things that you're experiencing within your community that you may not necessarily have some distance from. It may be within the household that you're living in. And so there are variations of components that we're having to look at. And so in terms of services and accessibility to those services, we specifically want to make sure that we are tailoring to the patients that we're serving. And we are not necessarily shaping our services to be accessible specifically for community that we're serving, then we're going to kind of miss the mark. For example, you wouldn't necessarily want to provide childlike interventions for an adult because it wouldn't necessarily hit or pinpoint or be relatable to that particular population. So we find it very important that we are being flexible in how we're providing services. And that means that if people are not necessarily feeling safe and or have the resources to be able to come to us, then we find ways to be able to come to them. And it's all about reduction of barriers. If a barrier is you don't necessarily have the social needs, or you don't have the resources to be able to receive services in a traditional way, then we work to find resources outside that will help to break those quote unquote traditions. Another barrier to services, I would say, is we have the stigma of actually receiving help and what that actually means within the particular community that that patient is in. If there's a stigma to receiving therapy or a stigma to receiving any type of help outside of your community, those are barriers that we have to work past and work with. And I think that oftentimes as agencies, we have this pressure to feel like we have to follow a certain guideline, we have to follow a certain model or rubric, so to speak. But one of the things that I would encourage everyone to look at is a way to improve is how instead can we work with the limitations that we have, and can we work with the patient population that we are serving? What are ways that we can instead focus on specifically providing services that are more tailored to the community that you're serving in a way that they can best receive? And a pure example of that is certain patient populations, it may be more accessible for them to instead coming to your facility. It may be more accessible for them to go to the local community agency that's there near them, that's, you know, a few blocks away from their home, or the church that's on the corner. And it may be instead finding ways to be able to bring services to them instead of trying to find ways to bring the patient to the services.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. And with that, I'm now going to transition to Chris Patterson. Chris is the Senior Director of Programs and Policy at the Institute for Nonviolent Chicago. So Chris, there are some people listening who come from communities like Austin, Back of the Yards, East Garfield Park, the areas in which you work. There are also listeners who come from outside of these neighborhoods who are unfamiliar with the work of community violence prevention and perhaps even uncertain around the causes of social unrest. So when media covers violent events in neighborhoods you work in, often the perpetrators are framed as evil people, as monsters, and I'm even seeing the resurgence of a super predator myth in some narratives. Yet these events of violence cannot be boiled down to a handful of bad people, and you understand this in your position as a director of programs and policy, that systems are involved in the construction of opportunity around the people that you work with. So Chris, I was wondering if you could begin to describe the connection between community violence and structural racism and what you do in your work with the Institute for Nonviolence.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that. It is some of the frustrating components of the work to figure out how to help people, but not negate accountability, for instance, right? To continue to move forward towards safer communities and not stare the elephant, the big elephant in the room in its eyes, right? And so, but that's a half painted picture, right? And the young people that we work with. So let me just paint a picture around what outreach looks like and some of the challenges around the policy component or the structural components of our work. So our street outreach workers go into a community, they reestablish or establish relationships with those who are at that really high threshold of violence. So those who are at risk of either shooting someone or being shot, and typically that's like 0.03% of people who drive 70% of the violence. So we're talking about a very small segment. It's a unique skill set to go out, identify folks, create a relationship with them, and then encourage and mentor them to the point where they need to make new decisions in their life, right? Cognitive behavior therapy is a tool often used. But now you're looking at this idea that, okay, well, and it feels very easy to do it just that way. You go in and you say, we're going to create, this opportunity for you. You've got an opportunity to go back to school and get an employment, do some stuff for your children, and it should be well. But the reality is, one of the programs that has done a study, the Ready Chicago program, which we work with in CP4P, Chicago Cred, more than 80% of our participants are categorically homeless, right? And so every morning, from the couch surfing to living with someone, not certain where tonight I'm going to sleep and put my head. Every morning, imagine having to wake up with that dilemma on your back. Imagine having to wake up every morning with this idea that you're going to take your backpack with you because everything you own is in your backpack. And so you're almost transient in everything that you do. 60+% of some of the participants we work with in our street outreach, 60+% don't have an 8th grade education. So now if you think about structural harm, and you think, like, what kind of system do we live in that allows children, essentially children, to stop school at the 8th grade level and not move forward? Where's the accountability, the truancy that I knew when I was growing up, or the phone calls home, for instance? 90+% of the people we work with are formerly incarcerated and on the level of felony convictions. And so now we're talking about the same person here. So the same person who's homeless, the same person who doesn't have, the mental health support, the same person who has a felony record on the back that prohibits them from having an employment opportunity that gives them a living wage, for instance. And then at the same time, as a society, we say, well, they got to do better, right? And on their own, without us providing a safety net, they've got to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and make it happen, and shame on them if it doesn't happen. And I think that we're coming to an understanding as a society, and particularly the conversations that have been happening around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders, and COVID-19 exposing so many of the injustices that are coming to light, that we're working with people at the Institute for Nonviolence who didn't have a fair head start and are having an equally hard time navigating systems and the hurdles and obstacles that are put in place for them. So, when we're out doing outreach work in the era of COVID-19, and we're trying to inspire hope and support to those who already had less of it. There's so many of us who may have a solid footing are anxious around what COVID-19 could bring for us. And so what does that do for someone where, the structural safety net, is missing? I think about two pieces. In a healthy child's life, you have a healthy family. And oftentimes that may mean two parents. And I've seen, I had a single mom parent, at times. And so you have this healthy network called family, and that could be aunts, uncles, cousins. And then when in communities like we work in, okay, well, if that family structure and that safety net doesn't exist, then the second safety net picks you up, right, through your parks and your schools and your after school programs. Now, if you're living in a community where both safety nets don't exist, right? So the dilemma, there's almost a sure fail system in place where we can't expect people to be able to move forward if those safety nets aren't there. And we have to get past the shaming idea that, where are the fathers? Why isn't the family, or the family is, solely responsible? And just take reality for what it is. If we are in a situation where people don't have the first safety net in place because of family being decimated because of mass incarceration, traumas, mental health issues, then society's just got to come to terms, as it often does with communities outside of the African American community, that it is the second wave of support for people who don't have the first wave. And that's where we fail. That's where we fail miserably. We're really struggling right now with supporting people through mental health supports. In the city of Chicago, there is no mental health support place, in the areas that I'm working in, that our participants can go to get the support they need in order to address the trauma of a friend who was just recently killed, or the fact that they were shot, or just recently released from incarceration. It's a tremendous and an amazing burden that this society has put on its own people, who then they expect to become productive inside this very society they're trapped in. And so, that's sort of the dilemma. I think, I don't like to be the person who just rains this cloud of negativity. There's so many good things happening. We have this panel here. There's a level of awakening that is happening across the country where people are calling for reforms to the structures. We have a Cook County state's attorney who is working on diversion programs for the first time, piling ideas around how do we divert, or a diversion program for those who are part of violence, right? So that was a conversation that wasn't happening prior. Any diversion programs that used to happen was only for nonviolence, right? So I think people are thinking differently around what do we do to help those who are trapped in those cycles of violence and the supports they need. So, for me, I feel optimistic. I know I feel like I just said a lot of negative, but the reality is, like, a lot of amazing people are on the front lines changing the dynamics for people who we serve. And, I'm just excited, for what, the rest of the remainder of the year is going to bring. I'm excited for, the momentum of the field of outreach from other professionals, men and women. We're part of a larger collaboration called Community Partnering for Peace that has 15 organizations that account for about 85% of the violence that happens in Chicago in 22 communities, right? So that's a significant presence in those neighborhoods that are blighted by violence. And everyone's working towards the same end: restorative justice, nonviolence, and making sure that, fewer mothers lose their children every year.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I didn't hear you through a lens of pure negativity. I actually saw you urging us to, urging a paradigm shift from, towards collective responsibility versus blaming the individuals or victim
That's right.
blaming. Okay,
That's
so
right.
I'm
Thank you.
very thankful for your contribution. I'm going to come back to some of the points that you just raised. So
Okay.
I'm going to ask now a question for both Orlando and Vicky. Okay, and ask that Orlando, if you could please respond first to the question. So while some forms of victimization are rarely covered by the press or figures in political discourse, gun violence is a constant topic, particularly gun violence in Chicago. What do you think the media, elected officials, and traditional narratives around gun violence in Chicago miss or obscure about the reality of gun violence and its interconnection to other forms of violence throughout the state? Okay, so I'm wondering if Orlando, you could take a stab at that first.
I think the reality is violence is a persistent problem in Chicago. It's not only Chicago, it's Central Illinois, it's Southern Illinois, it's Waukegan, it's East St. Louis, it's Decatur, Peoria, Rockford. So we know the problem is there. We know that it's constantly perpetuated by the interpersonal violence that occurs on the street level, but also systemic violence that comes from the top as well, right? So I don't want to dismiss that in any way. It is a reality, but among that reality, amidst that reality, there are very wonderful things happening in communities like Austin, Lawndale, East Garfield, West Garfield, back of the yards. Chris just highlighted our CP for P collective and the tremendous amount of work that goes into going into the community and building community by first establishing relationships. So we do have Light in the Night events during the summer and during the fall that bring people out to let them know that we are here for them, that the community is here for itself. And it does not happen in silos. It happens in a collaborative way. The work that's being done through the restorative justice hubs and really promoting the word that when one community suffers, we all suffer, right? And being able to identify and support that community that is suffering by offering different resources and ideas about how to build the capacity of a community that may be struggling. So when it comes to the media, I would hope that they understand that there needs to be a positive message being delivered as well. Like I'm sitting in a room surrounded by fathers, right? If you notice the pictures on the wall, these are African-American fathers that are surviving, that are thriving and being supportive of their children and their families, in addition to being supportive of the community. But that's not a story that you hear. You don't hear the story of a young brother who may be homeless and struggling and yet finding it within himself every single day to go to Ready, to go to the one opportunity that he has to try to make progress in his life, right? And I think the media should take a lead in doing that, because in addition to highlighting those positive stories and the positive impacts that organizations have on young people's lives and system impacted people's lives, it will also highlight all the things that Chris said: the need for housing, the need for more direct service resources, and not to make it a 1 year or a 2 year thing. This is something that we've been dealing with for hundreds of years. Systemic oppression has been occurring for hundreds of years. And we need to have the funding from the city, from the state, to reverse some of the effects of all those years of oppressive practices, legislations, and policies in order to support the work that we do, to continue building community in a collaborative way through organizations doing the good work in Chicago and Illinois, across the state.
Thank you, Orlando. We did get a question for clarification. If you could explain what is Light the Night?
Also, Light in the Night is the component of the CP4P collective, where we organize events in different parts of the communities we serve. We try to make those events as open to intergenerational contact. So the mothers, the grandfathers, along with the youngest of the children, but also being very intentional about engaging that emerging adult population so that they too feel part and connected to the community. So I know during COVID, it's been hard to have these events. So we've we've tried to rethink what that looks like. So instead of actually having big community events, what Light in the Night has been doing is bringing Light in the Night to different blocks so that it's not people coming out to Light in the Night events, it's Light in the Night coming to the people.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Orlando, for that clarification. And now, Vicky, do you want me to repeat the question, or do you have it fresh in your mind?
So we're talking about the different kinds of violence and the fact that we're working in such a large, diverse state, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I want to share the excitement of what is going on with the diversity of these programs that have come together for our Illinois Coalition of Shared Safety, because the root causes of violence in our society are all the same. I don't care where you live. I don't care what the specific kind of violence you're experiencing. The root causes are the same. And my colleagues have all made reference to them. The racism, the sexism, the poverty that the folks are dealing with on a regular basis that our systems have not responded to well at all, and understanding. I love the idea that we're finally taking a look at social determinants of health in the medical field to really figure out how do we help people in the long run. And the safety nets that Chris referred to are as critical for a person experiencing domestic violence as they are for somebody who's experienced gun violence or community violence. They're all the family barriers, the lack of responses, the lack of understanding from systems are the same. And when we look at our policy discussions, we often look at, especially when you look at it from a statewide perspective, it's Chicago versus everybody else. And the reality is Chicago's problems aren't different from the rest of the state. It's just the magnitude of them. And we also think about when you're in more rural parts of the state, there are a lot less resources. It's all out of balance everywhere, regardless of where you live, right? So if we can take a look at really the root causes of what's causing violence and have a better understanding that people need the same things. They need safe housing, they need food, they need jobs, they need access to medical care, access to education. When we come together and understand that, then we're less likely to be siloed. And I think we're more likely to get policymakers to understand the shift of resources. Somebody posted a question a second ago about the budget shortfalls. Yes, we all know that we're going to have budget shortfalls, but really being more strategic and smarter about the way we use the resources we have, and not just keep trying to do the things we've always done, but really take a look at what people need and what communities need and do that collectively. I think we're going to have a much better bang for our buck, for lack of a better term.
Thank you, Vicki. Your perspective on how we think about safety across the state is invaluable. I really appreciate your perspective. So now I have a question for Chris and for Dr. Lewis. So you both work for organizations that provide comprehensive services, both for the people that may have caused harm to others, as well as to the survivors of that harm. Your professional insights in your respective organizations challenge the notion that there are good victims who are innocent and worthy of support, and bad victims who deserve what happened to them. Nearly everyone who commits an act of violence has also survived it. However, few have received formal support to heal. And although someone's history of victimization does not excuse them from the harm they may have caused to somebody else, it does implicate us, our society, for not having addressed their pain earlier. The people I'm talking about have also been referred to as criminalized survivors, someone whose experience of violence is diminished, distorted, or erased, and they are instead simply seen as criminals who should be punished. So Blair, I was wondering if you could provide an example of a client who may have previously not been recognized as a survivor and how you effectively engage them in your trauma recovery center programming.
You know, you brought up the fact that oftentimes this particular patient population isn't necessarily treated in the same way. And there's no secret that when someone has a record or has committed crimes in the past, that society has a tendency to shift their focus and or see them from a different lens. And unfortunately, I've seen face to face, not necessarily from the Trauma Recovery Center, but I've seen how patients' care can be impacted once it is come to the light that they may have committed a crime in the past. And so now they're seen as quote unquote criminals. And our society is not great at treating this particular population, treating them well. And so one of the things that your Trauma Recovery Center does specifically is we're focusing on what exactly happened. We're not focusing on who they are, what their past is, what brought them to the present day. We just want to know what happened and how has it impacted you. And if you are instead able to focus on the individual and focus on how their experiences in life has brought them to their present day, then you're able to come from a place of understanding instead of coming from a place of being a detective to find out, you know, what was one, what was step two, and how did you get to present day. And so you asked, how did we engage this patient? How were we able to pull them in? And it was just that thing, being able to see them for themselves as a human and not the category that society likes to put them in, being able to see them for who they are and being able to understand and use empathy at its purest form is one of the simplest ways that we were able to get this patient that I'm thinking of engaged in our services. And this specifically started at the hospital. And this patient was starting to be identified on the unit as, you know, a problem patient. They're attention seeking. Here are the buzzwords that we often hear: non-compliant, they are difficult. But these are oftentimes, when you're looking at it from a trauma lens, those are signs that someone has experienced trauma and or is being impacted negatively by the trauma. And being able to step to the patient and instead have a conversation about what is it that they needed and what is it that they needed to be heard about was open. It just completely opened up the road, all of those obstacles that were in the way, because at the end of the day, we can relate to wanting to be heard. We all can relate to wanting to be understood. And we all can relate to the good feeling that we have when we know that we've been heard and we know that we have truly been helped. So what we started there, and from that point on, we started to work on addressing the patient's needs as much as we could and had a collaborative approach with them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. And Chris, I was wondering if you could build off of Dr. Lewis's response and also some of Orlando's contributions as well. And I want to ask you if you could reflect on why we need to hear from survivors who may have previously been excluded from conversations around safety and public resources.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was on mute. So your last question for me, it blurted out just a little bit, not the whole question, but just the last part of your question.
Sure. Can you share your reflections on why we need to hear from survivors who may have been excluded previously?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you. So for me, so the thing is, sometimes historically, you know, I'm a person with lived experiences. You know, and I know a lot of people, 90+% of my organization is occupied with people with lived experiences, meaning they've either been formerly incarcerated, gang involved, drug addiction, and or all. And, you know, there's a lot of policy that happens. There's a lot of decisions that happen without the voice of those who are directly impacted. And when we don't take the levels and the steps of respect to pay homage to the voice of experience. And I often think that, you know, the people who have lived through experiences are suited better to help other people get through those experiences. And they often know or understand the nuances and the small parts that if you've not experienced the situation, you may not know, and you could not possibly learn. And, you know, unfortunately, in so many instances, the parts that we're learning, those are hard lessons for people, right? And they've taken lifetimes. So I think there's a wealth of knowledge that could be shared and given to people, to the masses, if only we listen to the people who have those lived experiences a little better.
Thank you so much, Chris. So now we want to thank our attendees for submitting some questions in the chat. And we're going to begin with one of the questions submitted. I'm going to read it out loud, and this is open to any of our panelists to answer, okay? The question is, or it begins with a statement followed by a question, all right? The question is that the domestic violence movement used to have a clear political analysis, but accepting federal funding was prioritized over this political analysis. This has impacted how services are designed and implemented. What can we learn from this to prevent this from happening to the community violence shared safety framework?
So Catherine,
Excellent
if
question.
I could
Yes.
start with that, and then others can jump in, because I was actually at the table when we were creating the federal laws that has most affected the work that we do. So from the domestic violence community, I think what we've learned is that because we focused so much on using the criminal justice system as a means to try to get safety, really security, as John frames it, for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, that we put a lot of emphasis and a lot of faith that we would suddenly be able to change the way that system operates. And we did not fully listen to all the voices of victims in that time and place. And we have a lot of, especially our advocates of color, who are reminding us that there weren't enough people at the table, there weren't enough diversity making those decisions, and that we were focused on a more singular response rather than really listening wholly to survivors and the needs. And like I mentioned earlier, when you sit down and you talk to survivors, they need the same things that Chris mentioned. They need the same thing that Orlando mentioned. They have to have food, they have to have shelter, they have to have stability, they have to have the opportunity to support their family, they have to have the opportunity to build a family that's safe. That is not the focus of the federal dollars. And we've built a system that now people are afraid to challenge because it provides us funding. And so we need to rethink all of that and to really get back to the basics of where we were at when our movement was first developed, and pay much more attention to the broader voices of survivors to help us think about where we go in the future to help our communities.
Brilliant, Vicki. Thank you. Are there other panelists that would like to build off of Vicki's contribution? While you're thinking about your potential response, I want to make sure that Orlando put something in the chat that I would like to highlight that I think builds off of what Vicki's saying in response to an earlier question. He states, I also want to highlight that there is not a one-size-fits-all to the solutions needed in Illinois and specifically in Chicago. We must come up with approaches that are for Chicago and from Chicago. What works in New York or California may not be the answer we need for Chicago. Through the same lens, what works in Little Village may not work in Roseland. Being able to find solutions that come from the people, within our, that come from the people within our state and within our communities. The answers and solutions that we need are already there. We have community funds of knowledge. I love how you put that. Beautiful, Orlando. So are there any panelists that wanted to respond to the question that I posed, that Vicki responded to earlier, around how do we prevent maybe like a co-optation of coalition work based on funding opportunities? Okay, so that gives us an opportunity then to work through another. Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. We're going to work through another question now. The question is, for white allies, what is something we can do to create space and safety for those who have been marginalized to speak and to be heard without placing the burden to constantly be having these conversations? This was an excellent question. So I'll open it up to all of our panel members.
So as a white ally, I hope the white ally in this group, this esteemed group, one of the things that I talk a lot about is we just have to be quiet and listen. So having jumped out here and started talking first, it isn't that we don't need to have the conversations. We need to stop, we, the white people, need to stop relying and forcing people of color to keep teaching us. We need to learn, which means we have to be active and go out and listen and understand and participate, and not even like, we have to create safe space wherever we happen to be. I don't need to invite you to my table. I need to see if I can sit down with you and hear and listen and what we can work out together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vicki. I might call on some of the panelists to offer their insights. I'll reread the question again. For white allies, what is something that we can do to create a space and safety for those who've been marginalized to speak and be heard without placing the burden to constantly have these conversations? So Dr. Lewis, I'm wondering if you might be willing to take a first stab at this, and then I'll follow that with Chris.
Felt me like my finger was about to unmute myself. So
all right, the virtual connection. All right.
So to piggyback on Vicki's point, it really highlights collaboration. And you talked about this analogy around, or metaphor around, not being invited to a table versus me coming to your table and taking an approach of really being willing and wanting to learn, which I really, really appreciate. On top of that, I would add that collaboration is probably the only thing that's really going to help to bring some type of unity. If we do not collaborate, and I think that that's a buzzword that gets thrown around a whole lot, and is not necessarily always used in its truest form, but if we are able to collaborate and unify on a common ground, that this goal needs to be achieved, and we're going to achieve it this type of way, we as a society, as a nation, will be much stronger. And I feel like, it's very cliche to say, but as a person of color, and I've actually really enjoyed conversations around what can we do, here's how we're going to do it, and really, kind of joining forces. I appreciate conversations like that, and I actually appreciate movements. What I appreciate even more is people actually meaning it. When you're not doing it with a genuine heart, without true intent of wanting to learn, and you're just doing it just because it's a roadblock or you were told to do it, it's probably not necessarily needed at that point. So I would piggyback off of what Vicki said, and wanting to have a learning perspective and a learning heart, but do it in a genuine way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. Orlando, and then Chris, I'm wondering if you had any insights that you would like to share as well.
I think as difficult as these conversations and dialogue is, I think it's necessary. Like we've been subject to those conversations without us having been in those spaces for so long, that I think it's necessary for system impacted people to be in these spaces constantly, to be able to provide insight and to be able to really highlight what it is that we need. The only way that people are going to understand that and begin to listen is to first hear us, right? So I think, as difficult as it is to have to sit through these conversations over and over, reversing the effects of the socialization and internalized messages that we've been subject to all our lives is also necessary. So the de-education process is necessary, and these conversations often do that. I mean, I remember there has been a time where people like myself weren't even considered for conversations like this, and now to see, again, people like myself, like Chris, like everybody who's on this panel, to be included in these conversations and actually being heard is something that has not historically always been the case. seeing Black and brown people in these conversations has not always been the case. So I think that's my input. Just understanding that it is a necessary component, as painful and as brutal as it may feel.
I just
Yeah, and
want
for
to
my
affirm, oh, sorry, real quick. I just want to emphasize something really beautiful that you said, Orlando, that you talked about like unlearning, basically unlearning stereotypes or ways of thinking that have been handed to us, right? And that unlearning can be difficult and even painful and uncomfortable, but that there's a benefit to that, and that the that a shared safety framework is not only about collaborating but integrating voices at a decision-making table. So Chris, I apologize for disrupting your flow. Go for it.
No, it's fine. I think where, and I appreciate those prior comments. I think that's right on point. And I think the other part, if I could just add, it won't be long, is this idea where the power really lies at oftentimes, right? Especially as it moves policy and legislators, we have to, like, my white allies in the work have to get past their own insecurities too, right? So I work with quite a few people online, on Zoom, in concept, but who are like deathly afraid of going into Austin, for instance, where they're probably more safe than any young Black man in the whole community. And and I think it does go to those stereotypes that you just spoke about. But like, in order for us to move together in real collaboration, beyond collaboration, is like, we've got to cross over. Like, I need to know, in order for me to dream about what is possible for my own life, I have to see something better. And unfortunately, something better is often outside of my neighborhood. So it affords me the opportunity to step out my neighborhood and see that. And for my allies, it takes you coming into my neighborhood as well to really accurately see. Like, very few people who our allies to this cause actually know what Austin feels like and looks like on a ground level, outside of what WGN shows or Channel 7 shows on a daily basis. So I think we really need to be intentional about learning each other, and talking to each other, and then visually seeing where we come from, and then with empathy, understanding that and moving forward. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much for saying that. And I interpreted that as an open invitation, right? That if people are convicted and want to get involved in your work, that come and see, right? Oh, you're muted. Okay, cool. Thanks for the thumbs up. Okay, so we are going to be joined very shortly by our Illinois Attorney General, Kwame Raoul. So we may have time for just one more question, potentially two. Okay, so this question, again, from one of our wonderful attendees in the chat function, who said, what role can the police play in this? How can we approach the current institution of policing and help drive these kinds of changes within our police? This is a great question. I'm going to repeat it one more time and then invite panelists to spontaneously respond. So what role can the police play in this? How can we approach the current institution of policing and help drive these kinds of changes within our police? So I'm going to open that to the panelists to share their thoughts.
So, Catherine, I'm going to jump in here first, and I'm going to piggyback it with another question that somebody asked about: how do we create spaces for affected individuals? I think, just like what Chris just did, we have to have an open invitation to start talking. And right now, it feels like the police are way over here and advocates are way over here on the other side. So we have to find the individuals and begin that talking at the local level and build it out. Just like that public, or the prevention schematic that CDC uses, right? We start here and work our way out. And I don't know another way to do it. We have to start building better relationships, and we have to be able to experience with each other what the other is dealing with, and then build a critical mass that is going to really be able to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I know this is a tough question, but I'm actually going to go in the same order that I went for the previous. And if you just want to share a few thoughts or maybe ask more questions, maybe the question leads to another reflection that we think about in a subsequent town hall. I think this is a great conversation taking place. So if Dr. Lewis, if you'd be willing to share your thoughts, followed by Orlando and Chris, around how do you see police factoring into a vision of shared safety?
I can't help but to think about the origins of our police departments and how they got started. And if you're into gardening, which I'm not at all, and I will probably kill any plant that were stepping into my home, so I don't own one. But I know one simple thing, and it's all about the health of the roots. And if your roots are not healthy for that plant, it could potentially grow wrong, or it could be in jeopardy in the future, whatever the case may be. So I think it's actually the same here. In our country's history, we do not look at the origins of how many of these organizations, groups, entities were started and not truly evaluate and make some changes at its roots, then we're going to have some problems, or we're going to continue to have the problems that we have. So I'm sorry, that doesn't necessarily directly answer the question, but I do believe it requires an evaluation of how these organizations started, what were the true purposes of it, and how can we revamp and or redefine how it is being illustrated to this very day. And my hopes is that could not necessarily just clean up some areas, but it can redefine how we see our police departments at this current time. And I believe that oftentimes specific events can distort how people experience police and or how they see policing. But I believe that if we're able to redefine it, reevaluate, or revamp, let's restructure. We need some restructuring in a lot of different ways that potentially could help.
Dr. Lewis, what you just said is so beautiful. And I think it flows with a lot of the conversation we've had over the past hour and 15 minutes about looking at history, looking at the root causes of dysfunctional systems, and thinking about how we reimagine public safety through the experiences of those who are most harmed. I was just advised that our Attorney General has joined our town hall. And so I will, unfortunately, Orlando and Chris, if you would like to submit your thoughts into the chat function so that we make sure we heard from you in relation to how the police factor into a vision for shared safety, I am now going to introduce our Attorney General. So I'm very pleased to introduce Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul, who was sworn in as the 42nd Attorney General of Illinois in January of 2019. Attorney General Raoul was born in Chicago to Haitian immigrants and brings a lifetime of legal and policy experience, advocacy, and public service to the office of the Attorney General. As it pertains to today's town hall, I want to highlight some of his accomplishments during his tenure as a state senator representing the 13th Legislative District for 14 years. In the Senate, Attorney General Raoul served as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the vice chair of the Senate Criminal Law Committee, and the vice chair of the Sentencing Policy Advisory Commission. He sponsored legislation eliminating the death penalty, promoting law enforcement and criminal justice reform, in addition to some of the strongest voting rights protections in the nation. During his first 22 months in office, he has worked hard to engage community members, survivors, and their advocates to expand access to crime victims' compensation and reduce barriers to victim services throughout the state. Let us virtually welcome Attorney General Raoul.
Thank you, Catherine, for the generous introduction, and thank you to the Illinois Coalition for Shared Safety and to my friends at the Alliance for Safety and Justice, with whom I had an opportunity to work during my tenure in the legislature. Thank you both for the invitation to speak today and to address this town hall and all of those who are participating. I want to say a few words about the vision, the importance of the vision for shared safety. We are in a moment of severe crisis, one of which has brought into stark relief many challenges and inequalities that long predated the pandemic that we've been experiencing in this year of 2020. The pandemic has revealed the deadly intersection between poverty and systemic racism, and how poorly designed and under-resourced all of our systems have been to meet this moment. Decades of disinvestment in Illinois' Black and Latino neighborhoods, whether it's across housing, education, health, and more, have left communities vulnerable to the profound and deadly health impacts of COVID-19. Since the murder of George Floyd, I've talked about my own personal experiences with law enforcement, growing up on the south side of Chicago, and the gun violence that has impacted my community, both as I was growing up and as I raised my kids, and how it has impacted my family and my friends. What my personal experience and the experience of so many others in our state and throughout our country shows that we are not doing enough to invest and promote the drivers of health and safety that will increase trust people have in their government and advance the well-being of all communities, enabling us to flourish. In my role as AG, one of my priorities has been to remove the barriers that have long existed to assistance, whether those barriers are in law or in policies within my office, or unwritten policies and approaches. Our system can do a better job serving all crime survivors. Our office has also been involved in important reforms related to police reform. We're a party to the court-ordered consent decree requiring broad reforms in the Chicago Police Department, and we take seriously that responsibility to help monitor its compliance. I've also proposed a licensing system, a police licensing system, to operate at the state level for all law enforcement officers. Officers who have misconduct claims against them and other violations could have their licenses revoked, like doctors, lawyers like myself, pharmacists, hairdressers, barbers, and so many others. We've been doing a comprehensive multi-week training of the Chicago Police Department's domestic violence liaison officers. Our office seeks out all opportunities to advocate for effective and constitutional policing. And in doing so, we refuse to fall into the false dichotomy in which a mention of racial bias in policing elicits questions about Black on Black crime. Or alternatively, where denouncing violence and destruction in our communities during protests or otherwise draws a question about, what about police abuse? We can and we must be opposed to both unconstitutional policing and community violence. This is why I'm thankful for the coordination of this new coalition based on shared safety. Your efforts support the reforms I'm implementing in my own office and a holistic vision of what it means for our communities to be safe. Last year, similarly, I convened 3 town hall meetings bringing together domestic violence, sexual assault, and community violence social service providers. While each of these groups provide a distinct set of services, I understand their work is interconnected, and the needs of survivors they support are often the same or related. In my efforts to expand access to victim services, initially the concern was raised that I was taking resources away from entities to give to others, so-called robbing Peter to pay Paul. This clearly has not been the case. It's not been the case. Rather, my vision is to promote safety for all Illinois residents and to advocate for resources for all of those who play a part in keeping our community safe at the community level. That's why I'm so excited about the Illinois Coalition for Shared Safety, a group that reflects the diversity of our service providers and their communities. In my time as in the General Assembly as a state senator, I worked on every key public safety issue that came to the General Assembly. I can't remember a time during that time working with a group as diverse and as comprehensive as this coalition. I want to encourage you to continue your advocacy and to continue to grow and bring new voices from across our state. I thank you for this opportunity to address you again and for your collective work. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, General Raoul. And I wish we had time for questions, but due to time constraints, if you have questions for the General as well, you can put them in the chat function. We'll make sure to relay them appropriately. And we're so thankful for your contribution, perspective, and service. To conclude today's events, out of gratitude for our Attorney General for providing the concluding comments, I also want to thank the more than 200 people who registered for today's events as well. We received fantastic questions in the chat box and in the Q&A, and we wish we had more time to have our incredible panelists respond to these questions. However, we want you to know that all the questions that have been asked today have been recorded, and we are going to include them in a series of future town halls. So to wrap up, I want to share a personal reflection. For the past 11 years, I have facilitated a support group for families of homicide victims on Chicago's Southwest Side. And this is the only support group in our city facilitated completely in Spanish that embraces a survivor-centered empowerment through healing approach. During COVID-19, we shifted our group from an in-person meeting to a conference call, and we have families call in from 8:30 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Friday nights. And this past Friday, we had a new mother join our call, and she called in as she began her shift working as a janitor. As she talked about her experience of visiting the cemetery each week to visit her daughter, we could hear her in the background wringing out the mop and cleaning the floors in this vacant building. She frequently had to pause her reflection due to tears that came from thinking about the traumatic loss of her daughter. I was thankful that I didn't have to be talking at that time because I found myself also crying, thinking of a mother alone in an empty building, cleaning late at night, mourning the loss of her daughter. Grieving is a luxury to the poor and to the marginalized. Attending therapy sessions, practicing self-care, taking a leave from work are too often denied to survivors whose experiences have been reflected in this panel. It's also a luxury and a privilege to have a town hall like this one where we can sit back and reflect on the pain of others. Talking does not stop the bleeding, and in recognition of this privilege, we conclude today's town hall with a call to action. As we stated earlier, to move our systems away from security to shared safety, we need a community of shared safety. By Monday, you will receive a recording of the town hall, the PowerPoint, and a survey and ways in which you can get involved in the Coalition for Shared Safety. We will plan to host and help facilitate more conversations like this one. In the material that you will receive on Monday, you will have the contact information of the organizers of this town hall, and you're also free to reach out to John Mackey and Marissa Rona if you have questions. I want to thank you again, and as you leave this town hall, I want to ask you to imagine. One of the effects of traumatic loss is that it robs its subjects of the ability to think about a future. A vision for shared safety allows us to dream of a future through healing from our past. In grieving, we have the opportunity to heal and imagine a new future. Thank you very much.